to start?
Yeah, so we have this tradition where Sam and Jurgen greet a keynote speaker, which this year will be Simona. Yeah.
Simona?
So this is like the official opening where we have the ribbon.
Yes.
Okay, so this is an even more important job.
Yeah.
Okay. I will not split Angular and NGB, so I will just cut here.
Wow.
Yay!
Awesome. Thank you so much. Wow, how incredible. I thought that everything that Carmen and Xenia presented was so impressive, and it just shows how much the NGB team is investing in actually building a community. So it's not just a conference. It's really, truly a community. And it's really wonderful to see that they're not only investing in creating this wonderful day with wonderful content, but also they're making a lot of efforts to connect you with job seekers, with companies, and also investing in the new generation of Angular developers, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So kudos and huge round of applause for that. That's really impressive. All right, and in this talk, we're gonna focus on all of the awesome ways in which we're accelerating the developer experience with Angular. And I'm gonna start with a story. It's about the American Air Force back in the 1950s. Pilots were having trouble controlling their aircrafts, and incidents were on the rise. And they couldn't understand why, what was going on. They looked at the skills, they looked at the tech, and nothing was coming up until they looked at the cockpit. And what was interesting about the cockpit was that it was created for the average person. But who is really the average person here? What they discovered is that in trying to fit the average person, it didn't actually fit anyone. And once they made this discovery, they redesigned the controls in the cockpit to be adjustable so that they meet the unique needs of their pilots. And that truly laid the foundation of expanding the Air Force to women and building a more diverse and inclusive workforce. So how does that apply to Angular, you might ask? Well, Angular is a very opinionated framework, and we know that that's one of our strengths. But we also know that each of you, like the pilots, has a different set of problems that you're solving for, a different set of tools that you like using, and a different set of customer needs that you need to address. And just as the Air Force made those controls flexible, in the same way we're building into the framework the knobs so that developers can use it, you can use it in a way that it actually fits your needs. And the first step of that journey is simplification. One of the ways in which we can simplify that journey is to reduce the number of concepts that developers need to learn early in their journey. With standalone components, directives, and pipes, we're making NG modules optional. So that getting started with Angular is much simpler. With standalone components, getting started with an application is as simple as writing your component and then bootstrapping your application using that component. So it reduces the surface of concepts, but it also reduces the surface of the code that you have to write and parse and read and understand. One of the side effects of standalone is that components are now the smallest unit of reuse, and you can directly lazy load your components. This actually ends up simplifying cases like the router config quite a lot. And speaking of the router, rewriting some of the router APIs to add support for standalone actually enabled us to shave off about 11% of the router bundle whenever you're not using some of the features like SSR and a couple others. Over the past year, we've stabilized standalone APIs, and we've started working on tooling to ensure that you have exactly the same developer experience that you have with NG modules today. So in version 15.2, we've added support for standalone migration tooling, so you can easily update your projects to use standalone. That's a celebration! Yay! Love it! To kick off a migration, or get up a migration, you can run ng-generate Angular core standalone. And this is a multi-step migration. During the first step, the migration converts all of the components, directives, and pipes to standalone by setting standalone to true and by adding their dependencies to the imports array. The second step removes unnecessary ng modules. The migration considers whether a module is safe or not to remove. And it's safe if it has no declarations, no providers, no bootstrap components, it doesn't bootstrap components, and it has no class members. And if it's not safe to remove that module, then we're going to leave a to-do comment in your application so that you know that you have that task. We're basically giving you homework. But we prioritize correctness over doing all of the work. So whenever you're running this migration, we want to make sure that at each and every single step of the way, you end up with a correct application that continues to run the way that it used to. And the final step is to switch to standalone bootstrapping APIs. In V16, we're also adding support for creating a new standalone project by running ng-new ngb, for example, -- standalone. And the new standalone application no longer includes the root module. It does include a new application configuration file where you can choose to configure your application providers and anything else that has to do with application config. But what I want to show you is the evolution of the Getting Started project over different versions. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have a new project, a Hello World project in version 16. And on the right-hand side, you have the V14 Getting Started project. We've done significant work towards simplifying the structure of these projects so that it's much easier to get started with Angular, to learn Angular, and onboard all of your new colleagues, onboard the new Angular students, and make sure that the NG Girls workshops are going smoothly and folks have to process as little concepts as possible in the beginning. So thank you so much for being on this journey with us. And you have been there throughout the process. During the early days in the GitHub RFCs, providing your input, replying and making suggestions during those RFC times, during the developer preview, getting your hands dirty and working with Standalone and continuing to provide input and file issues and kind of try out some of the more advanced use cases. And we have stable APIs with Standalone where we have some of the tooling that's required for that excellent developer experience, but we still have a bit of work to do. We need to update the Angular documentation and the learning journeys to include Standalone. And we're working also on updating our runtime schematics to make it easier for library authors to actually add support for Standalone. And finally, we do need your help. In order for every Angular developer to be able to use Standalone, we actually need every single library out there and tool to be able to support Standalone. So we need you all to think through, are you maintaining any libraries? Are you maintaining any tools? Do you have the bandwidth to work on updating those to have support, to include support for Standalone? Or maybe, are you interested in contributing to a new library? This could be your first contribution, maybe. consider updating any Angular library nearby so that it includes Angular standalone support. Apart from simplifying the learning experience, Standalone actually allows us to ship features that weren't possible before. For example, let's take this scenario where you have two directives that should always be used together. How do you ensure that that is always the case? Good question, right? I know at least some of you in this room have struggled with this question. And maybe you have tried to kind of use inheritance and use TypeScript and extend your menu with tooltip class with two different classes. But actually, TypeScript will very loudly tell you that, no, that is not OK, and you're not allowed to do this. TypeScript only allows you to extend one class at a time. Another thing is make sure that you make use of your memory. And you could remember every time to set CDK tooltip and CDK menu attributes anytime that you're using menu with tooltip. But that is probably going to be error prone because I'm sure that there's at least one template where someone has forgotten to add those attributes. And especially when you're maybe updating, let's say the first time that you're making this change, everything works well. But if you're updating and adding new behavior like event tracking or touch gestures, then you have to remember all of the places in which you're using menu with tooltip. And maybe you can use VS Code search, and that could be helpful. But it requires a lot of manual steps. If you're feeling adventurous, you could use TypeScript mixed-in functions, which allow you to inherit from multiple classes. But that requires a lot of boilerplate, and they're error-prone, and they don't really support all of the Angular features that you love. So we've seen, and the font here is not too big, but Angular devs have long wanted to reuse behaviors from directives without actually exposing or those directives showing up in the public API. And this has been one of our most requested features on GitHub. I don't know if you see there, but it's up to more than 600 upvotes. So to resolve these issues, the awesome Christian has introduced the new directive composition API in Angular v15 that is enabled by Standalone. So if you're wondering what is one feature that you should be using very easily from v15, directive composition API is definitely one of them. And with this new directive composition API, you can rewrite the previous example like this. The host directives array tells Angular that whenever a menu with tooltip is created, the CDK tooltip and the CDK menu directives will also be applied to it as well. So you have to define them in the host directives property on your component. You can also expose the inputs and outputs for your directives, and you can also change their names if you wanted to. These are some of the features of the new composition API. You can apply as many directives to the host as you want. Inputs and outputs are hidden by default. Developers have the option of exposing them and renaming them in a more meaningful way if they choose to. All Angular features are supported, things like dependency injection, host bindings, and many, many others. Host directives execute before their host to allow for the defaults to be overridden. They're also chainable and injectable. There are a couple limitations or a couple of checks that we had to put in place to make sure that the behavior is consistent with the rest of the framework. So host directives have to be standalone, but the host itself can be normal component or ng module component. Well, can be a component as well. Components cannot be used as host directives, and you can only have one directive instance per element. And if you want to learn more about the composition API, Jeremy has actually created an excellent video on our YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed and you haven't liked the Angular YouTube channel, highly recommend to check it out because the Angular team is actually posting regular updates here, and we usually have live stream parties whenever we release a new version. We have also made some more improvements to give you superpowers. We're simplifying the code that you write. We simplify how you test your code and how you debug it. And over the years, we've seen a lot of requests to add the ability to specify that an input is required. So one of the things that we have landed as part of version 15.2 is required inputs, which basically allow you to mark inputs as required. And whenever you're not setting those inputs, then you're going to get a compiler error. So you can see here an example for the tooltip directive. I'm setting the position input to be required in the inputs array. You can also use the input decorator to set a property or an input to be required, for example, message. And then when you're using in your template this directive, you're going to get a message that you haven't specified message and position. We've also made significant improvements to the router. This is probably one of the most underrated parts of Angular, and Andrew Scott has made consistently and very diligently a lot of improvements over the past 2 years, and they span across accessibility, testing, performance, and general developer experience improvements. So you can see here one of the changes that we've made is streamlining managing page title in the router by allowing you to set the title property on the route, or if you have more advanced use cases, you can also use title strategy to configure more advanced settings for your page title. This is very useful for assistive technology as well. So setting that title, highly recommended. We also have this awesome contribution from Dario, which allows developers to set area current when a router link is active. And area current should be used to inform the assistive technology user that this is the current active element within its group. So if accessibility is very important for your users or for your company, I highly recommend that you start using some of these new changes in the router. We've also added test helpers for triggering navigations in tests, and this enables you to write better tests without having to mock some of the router functionality. It will be less brittle. Make sure to check that out. There's also a blog post on the Angular blog explaining more of these improvements. And finally, one of the things that I know a lot of you love, there's a couple of you that are not as happy about it, but just give it a couple weeks, and then you're going to get very used to it. Functional router guards, we've added support for them, I think, in 14 or 15, and they are lightweight, ergonomic, and more composable than class-based guards. We basically now can write in a single line of code what was a different file and an entire class. So in this example, we have a functional guard that takes a component as a parameter, like the edit component, and it returns whether or not a route can be deactivated based on the component's has unsaved changes property. We are also working on making your dev workflow as simple as possible so you can quickly iterate on those awesome ideas and on those awesome features that you're building. In the wider ecosystem, we're seeing a shift towards native tooling, which results in faster build time and for your dev and your production environments. And currently, in Angular, the builder uses Webpack as a bundler. We then use ESBuild for code optimizations like function inlining, and then Cursor for further code compressions. And while this configuration is actually very performant, we recognize that with the recent evolution of tools like ESBuild and many others, we really think that we can do better. So last year, we introduced experimental support for ESBuild, for ngBuild, which compiles pure ESM output. And we've also included support for watch mode for your dev workflow, and we're actively working on adding a dev server as well for ESBuild. We continue to work on closing the feature gap between Webpack and ESBuild in Angular with the goal to make ESBuild stable. And if you're wondering why do we want to do this or what is actually the impact, on the left-hand side, I've built a new Hello World project using the currently stable build pipeline, and it takes about 7 seconds to build. On the right-hand side, I've configured a new project to use the ESBuild-based pipeline, and it takes about 3.67 seconds. So this is consistent with our findings that with ESBuild, we can have 57% faster code builds. And you can enable this today in your project by editing angular.json file and replacing Angular, like build Angular browser with build Angular browser ESBuild. Be aware that this feature is currently in experimental mode. So we're really looking for your feedback. It might not work in all cases. There might be situations in which your workflow might not be exactly the same. Do let us know. That's going to be very useful so that we can actually close that feature gap as soon as possible. OK, so we've talked about how we're improving how you write code. We've talked about how we're making it simpler for you to get those fast iterations. And we also want to make sure that debugging is much easier and simpler for you. That's one of the main points that when we go through the annual developer survey, we get a lot of feedback around that. So over the past year, the Angular team has worked with the Chrome developer team to launch improvements to the debugging experience in DevTools directly in Chrome. And people from both teams work together to enable developers to debug and profile applications from the authoring perspective. When you're debugging applications using Chrome DevTools, authors generally want to see just the code that they have written, not the code of the framework or any other node dependency. So here I'm in Chrome DevTools, I'm searching for a component, and my component is actually the last result that I'm getting there, and everything else has to do with node dependencies and framework code. And we wanted to improve that experience so that you only see the code that you've written yourself. And to achieve this, the DevTools team has introduced an extension to source maps that's called Google Ignore List. And this extension is used to identify third-party sources such as framework code or bundler-generated code. And whenever a framework is using this extension, authors can now automatically avoid this code that they don't want to see or they don't want to step through without having to manually configure this beforehand. And I'm explicitly saying when a framework uses this, because we have made this, we've worked together with the Chrome DevTools team to make this a much better experience for Angular, but this is actually available for all frameworks out there to implement. And we've seen, I think the team at Nuxt already implementing support for this, and it just improves the overall experience for all web developers out there. The same is true for stack traces. So here we see that app component is just one line in all of these calls, and we want to make that better. So now we have more relevant stack traces. And if you do want to see all of the call frames, then you can click there on Show More. But you get more context in your errors in a way that it continues to keep you in the flow of your own code, of your own application. And the same is true for debugging as well, where now you're going to get the context of your own application without having to step debug through Zone.js. You're staying in the zone while not step debugging through Zone.js. That was a bad joke. With all of these improvements, our goal is to meet developers where they are and reduce the friction of building great experiences for the web. And ultimately, our goal is to help you put the user at the center and build faster applications by default. And one way to measure your user's experience with your application is by looking at Core Web Vitals. And the metrics that make up Core Web Vitals, they usually evolve over time. And the current one focuses on 3 different aspects of the user experience: loading, interactivity, and visual stability. So largest contentful paint focuses on loading, first input delay on interactivity, and cumulative layout shift on visual stability. And Pavel, who will give a talk later today, he's done tons of work in investigating some of the challenges with some of these core web vitals. So make sure to reach out to him if you've experienced any challenges there. But we have worked with the Chrome Aurora team to investigate and continue to improve core web vitals by default for Angular projects. And one of our recent focuses has been improving LCP for all Angular applications. And looking at data that is published on HTTP Archive, one of the things that we've seen is that between 70% to 80% of pages had an LCP element that was an image, which was great, because that tells us that we can improve the experience in 70% of the cases if we do some work on improving how images are loaded in applications. So we focused on kind of laying what are the best practices for loading pages and for loading images, and how can we make sure that we implement them by default in your Angular applications. And we focus on a couple of things, making sure that you're intelligently lazy loading images that are not the priority image while prioritizing the critical images. We've also added optimized configuration for popular image tooling like CDNs, and we guide you through that process with built-in errors and warnings. So in your applications today, you can use the new image directive by updating your image source to use ng-src. And you can immediately see improvements in your core web vitals. And throughout this process, you will continue to get warnings about maybe pre-connecting to image CDN and actually setting up your image CDN and serving images in modern formats so that you can improve both your LCP, and this has also impact on your cumulative layout shift as well. Do check out our developer guide for more information, and start using it today if you care about core web vitals and the user experience that you're building. Looking ahead, there's a couple explorations that are top of mind for the team and that we are actively working on. One of the ones that we care a lot about is continuously improving our documentation. And this year, we're focusing on improving the initial learning journey, the usability of docs by potentially making them more interactive, and improving the consistency of the presentations of topics. We're also improving server-side rendering, where we've done some work on non-destructive hydration. We've done some work on adding support for Standalone, and we're working on dev server improvements. And finally, we're working on evolving Angular's reactivity with a few goals to enable per component change detection, zoneless Angular, computed properties, and many, many others. Pavel here will give an entire talk about this, and there will actually be multiple talks today about Angular's reactivity. So please stay tuned for those. But keep in mind that as we're making these explorations, we're exploring these topics with the priority of evolving Angular while maintaining platform stability and making sure that we bring everyone along. And also maintaining the properties of an opinionated framework that includes those knobs so that you can use the framework in a way that exactly fits your needs. Thank you so much.